You are standing still because you have been told not to move. The air is cold, thin, unfamiliar. You hear footsteps, but they do not hurry. Nothing here hurries. Somewhere behind you, a door closes without force, without drama, as if this moment has happened so many times that sound itself has grown tired of reacting. You do not know where you are being taken. You only know that you are no longer where you were. The year is 1219. You are inside the expanding world of the Mongol Empire, at the precise moment when resistance has already ended and consequence has begun. The noise of battle is gone. What follows is quieter. It always is. For those captured in the empire's wake, especially women, survival did not mean safety. It meant transfer. It meant reassignment. It meant becoming part of a system that did not require rage or cruelty to function, only obedience and efficiency. And as the rules of this system became clear, one truth settled heavily over everything that followed. For many, death on the battlefield would have been simpler than what came next. What happened to captured women under Mongol expansion is often framed as chaos, as the inevitable disorder of conquest. But that framing is comforting. It suggests loss of control, impulse, accident. The reality was colder. What unfolded was not random. It was organized. The Mongol Empire did not rely on improvisation. It relied on procedure. By the early 13th century, the Mongols were no longer a loose confederation of tribes. They were an empire with administration, hierarchy, and codified expectations. Under Genghis Khan and his successors, conquest followed a repeatable pattern. Cities were assessed, populations were categorized, skills were identified, assets were redistributed. Captured women were part of that accounting. They were not taken in moments of uncontrolled violence. They were sorted after silence returned. Records were kept. Decisions were made about where they would go, who would claim them, and what function they would serve within the imperial structure. Some were assigned to households. Some were absorbed into court life. Some disappeared into spaces the records never fully described. What mattered was not their consent. What mattered was utility. This system did not require constant force because it was built to remove choice. Once inside it, resistance rarely produced escape, only reassignment. And so compliance, or something that looked like it, became the only visible outcome. History later mistook that appearance for acceptance. The Mongol leadership understood something fundamental about power. Terror is most effective when it does not need to repeat itself. The reputation of the empire did much of the work. Stories traveled ahead of the armies. Cities surrendered not because they believed mercy was coming, but because they understood refusal narrowed the range of possible futures. For women, especially those of noble or skilled backgrounds, capture carried a specific weight. They were seen not only as individuals, but as symbols of defeated lineages, defeated cultures, defeated autonomy. Absorbing them into the empire served multiple purposes at once. It erased continuity. It rewarded loyalty. It reinforced hierarchy. This was not brutality for spectacle. It was governance. The Mongol legal framework, often referred to as the yasa, emphasized order, obedience, and discipline. While much of it was transmitted orally, its principles were enforced consistently. Personal desires of commanders were constrained by expectations of loyalty to the empire. That did not protect the vulnerable. It simply ensured that exploitation followed rules.
Women taken after conquest entered a world where their previous identities no longer applied. Names were replaced, kinship ties were severed, language itself became a barrier. Isolation was not a side effect, it was a condition. Without community, without familiarity, without recourse, endurance became internal. This is where the historical record grows thin. Chroniclers of the Mongol Empire, many writing under its authority, focused on victories, reforms, and trade routes.
They cataloged horses and taxes and military formations with precision. The lives absorbed into the private spaces of power were not granted the same attention. What happened behind walls, inside camps, within households was rarely considered worthy of detail. Not because it was unknown, because it was normalized. When you listen to dark inquest history, this is the silence you are being invited to notice. Not the noise of conquest, but what followed after the noise no longer served a purpose. The systems that continued operating when attention moved on.
The lives that became invisible precisely because they were managed so efficiently. To understand the human cost, you have to resist the temptation to imagine constant suffering. That image is misleading. What many endured was worse in a different way. Duration, uncertainty, waiting without an end date, living under rules that could change without warning, enforced by people whose language you did not speak and whose expectations you were required to meet. Some women were moved repeatedly as political alliances shifted. A household today could become a liability tomorrow.
Stability was conditional. Safety was borrowed. Every silence carried the possibility of reassignment. For elite captives, the experience was especially complex. Proximity to power did not mean protection. It meant visibility. And visibility meant vulnerability to the ambitions of others. Being noticed was not a privilege, it was a risk. Consider the women taken from Khwarezmian territories after the empire's westward expansion. They came from courts with their own traditions, their own hierarchies, their own expectations of dignity. Those frameworks collapsed overnight. What replaced them was not chaos, but something more disorienting. Order without familiarity. They were expected to adapt quickly, to learn new customs, to anticipate unspoken rules. Failure did not require punishment to be devastating. Disfavor alone could determine one's fate. Many did not leave written accounts. Those who might have were rarely in positions to record their experiences. Literacy did not guarantee voice. Survival often depended on silence, and silence leaves no archive. What we know instead comes from gaps, sudden disappearances from genealogies, abrupt endings in correspondence, references to transfers without explanation. These absences are not accidental, they are structural. The Mongol Empire expanded faster than most societies in history. To sustain that expansion, it needed predictability. It needed systems that could absorb conquered populations without constant rebellion. Fear played a role, but so did routine. Once conquest became expected, resistance lost its appeal. For captured women, this meant that suffering did not need to be dramatic to be effective. It only needed to be reliable. A future narrowed step by step until choice no longer appeared relevant. This was not about individual cruelty. Many of those enforcing the system likely believed they were acting normally, even responsibly. That is what makes it unsettling. When harm is procedural, no one feels fully responsible. When abuse is embedded in structure, it becomes invisible to those who benefit from it. The empire did not collapse because of this system. It thrived. Trade flourished, communication expanded, laws were enforced. From the outside, it appeared stable.
That stability was built on lives quietly rearranged to serve its needs. And for those inside it, those who had been captured, reassigned, absorbed, time did not heal. It only extended. This wasn't an accident of history. It wasn't the excess of undisciplined soldiers. It was policy expressed through silence, control exercised through normalization, a reminder that power does not need to be loud to be total. As the empire continued to grow, these practices became routine enough to escape notice entirely. Later historians would argue over numbers, over intent, over legacy. But the individuals within the system remained largely unnamed.
Their endurance was assumed, their absence from the record interpreted as compliance. What wasn't written down mattered as much as what was, because erasure is not always destruction. Sometimes it is administration, and this is only the beginning. The system did not announce itself to those entering it. There was no declaration, no formal sentence pronounced aloud. Control arrived gradually, through expectation, through repetition, through the quiet understanding that nothing you once were carried authority here. Captured women were introduced to the empire not as prisoners, but as resources. That language mattered. Resources are managed, allocated, preserved when useful, discarded when inconvenient. This framing allowed the Mongol administration to integrate human lives into logistics without acknowledging moral consequence. The vocabulary itself did the work of erasure. Once classified, movement followed routes as established as trade roads. Women taken from conquered regions were distributed across camps, courts, and households that spanned thousands of miles. Distance was not incidental. It ensured separation from origin, from memory, from any coherent sense of belonging. Familiar landmarks vanished. Time itself became difficult to measure. This dispersal was strategic. By breaking continuity, the empire reduced the likelihood of collective resistance. Isolated individuals do not organize. They adapt or disappear. And adaptation under these conditions rarely looked like survival in any meaningful sense. It looked like endurance without expectation. The Mongols were precise observers of human behavior. They understood that fear loses efficiency when it is constant, so fear was rationed. Long stretches of enforced normality were interrupted by sudden change. A reassignment, a removal, a closed door that did not reopen. These moments required no explanation. Explanation would have implied accountability. Instead, silence became instruction. Within elite households, women occupied ambiguous positions. Some were afforded material comfort, education, proximity to power. None of these equaled security. Favor was temporary, protection was conditional. Being useful today offered no guarantee about tomorrow. Political shifts could transform status instantly, without warning or appeal. This uncertainty was not accidental. It reinforced dependency. In many cases, women were used to solidify alliances between commanders. Transfers functioned as gestures of loyalty, signals of trust, or reminders of hierarchy. A woman's presence in a household often reflected relationships between men rather than any choice she had made. Her body became a symbol of political alignment, her silence assumed to signify acceptance. What history records about these arrangements is sparse and sanitized. Chroniclers described households expanding, lineages continuing, alliances strengthening. They did not describe the cost. That cost was understood but not discussed. It existed outside the frame of official memory. What wasn't written down is where the weight lives. Some women attempted to preserve fragments of identity through ritual, language, or private routine. These acts were small, invisible, and fragile. They left no trace for historians to follow. Others abandoned such efforts entirely, recognizing that remembering could itself become a form of suffering. Forgetting was sometimes safer. The empire did not require them to be broken. It required them to function. From the Mongol perspective, this was order.
A stable empire required predictability. Predictability required compliance. Compliance was easier to obtain when resistance appeared futile. The system delivered that lesson without needing to repeat it aloud. As decades passed, this framework became self-sustaining. New generations inherited it without questioning its origins. Practices once associated with conquest were absorbed into tradition. What began as policy hardened into expectation. This is how harm persists without visible violence. When you examine Mongol records closely, you find meticulous attention to logistics, numbers of horses, quantities of grain, distances between camps.
Human experiences are rarely granted similar specificity. That absence is telling. It suggests not ignorance, but prioritization. What mattered to the empire was not how individuals felt, but how efficiently the system moved. Captured women were expected to adapt not only behavior, but perception, to learn when to speak and when not to anticipate moods, to understand that unpredictability belonged to those in power, not those under it. Over time, this constant calibration reshaped internal life. Fear did not need to be expressed. It became background.
Some women vanished entirely from the historical record after capture. No death is recorded, no transfer noted. They simply stop appearing. Modern readers often interpret this as a gap in sources, but gaps themselves can be evidence. When disappearance is common enough to go unexplained, it suggests a system comfortable with loss. Others appear briefly in foreign accounts, usually through the observations of travelers or diplomats. These references are fleeting, indirect, cautious. Outsiders noticed the presence of women from distant lands within Mongol courts, but rarely asked how they arrived there or under what conditions they remained.
To inquire too deeply would have been dangerous. Silence protected everyone involved. About halfway through this story, it becomes necessary to acknowledge why remembering matters. Dark inquest history exists to examine precisely these silences, to look at what power normalized and what history accepted without scrutiny. Continuing this work is not about condemning the past. It is about understanding the mechanisms that made suffering sustainable. The Mongol Empire's success depended on its ability to absorb difference without allowing it to challenge authority.
Women's lives became one of the tools through which that balance was maintained. Their experiences were not anomalies. They were features. This wasn't chaos masquerading as order. It was order operating exactly as designed. As the empire stabilized, the initial shock of conquest faded. For those captured earlier, this created a new kind of confinement. There was no longer an expectation of release or resolution. The situation simply was. Endurance became open-ended. Futures narrowed into routine. In some cases, women were integrated deeply enough into households that they outlived the men who claimed authority over them. This did not necessarily bring freedom. New hierarchies replaced old ones. Dependence shifted rather than disappeared. The system absorbed transitions smoothly. What is striking is how rarely resistance is recorded. This absence has often been misread as passivity. In reality, resistance in such environments rarely looks like rebellion. It looks like survival strategies that leave no trace. Compliance performed to avoid worse outcomes. Silence chosen because speech carried consequences. The most profound harm was not always inflicted directly. It was the removal of alternatives.
The narrowing of possible futures until adaptation felt indistinguishable from choice. As Mongol rule extended across generations, cultural memory adjusted. Stories of conquest emphasized speed, discipline, innovation. The private costs were folded into the background. Later empires would study Mongol methods for governance and warfare. Few examined the human structures that made such expansion possible. Those structures relied on invisibility. For the women who lived within them, life continued without narrative arc. There was no climax, no resolution, no redemption promised.
Only time passing under constraint. Only roles that could change without warning. Only the understanding that identity was conditional and memory unreliable. What history often celebrates as stability was experienced as permanence without agency. And yet, traces remain in altered customs, in borrowed words, in genetic legacies that speak without context. These fragments hint at lives lived under control rather than chaos, at systems that shaped behavior so thoroughly that resistance became internal. The Mongol Empire eventually fractured, as all empires do.
Borders shifted, names changed, dynasties fell. But the individuals absorbed into its machinery did not re-emerge when the structure weakened. They had already been consumed by it. Their stories survive not through detailed testimony, but through pattern, through repetition, through the recognition that such systems do not require constant brutality to be devastating. They only require acceptance. And acceptance, once enforced long enough, becomes indistinguishable from tradition. By the time the system reached maturity, it no longer needed to explain itself.
New arrivals sensed the rules almost immediately, not because they were written, but because they were enforced through absence of choice, of appeal, of alternatives. The empire did not need to threaten. Its reputation had already done that work. For captured women, daily life was shaped less by overt punishment and more by constant evaluation. Attention could elevate or endanger. Neglect could preserve or erase. Every interaction carried consequence, even when nothing was said, especially when nothing was said. Silence became the primary language of power.
Within Mongol households, hierarchy was rigid but fluid. Status could change based on political currents far beyond one's control. A woman's position was not determined by merit or loyalty alone, but by shifting alliances among men who rarely considered her perspective relevant. Stability existed, but only temporarily. This uncertainty produced a particular kind of fear, one without a clear object. There was no single moment to prepare for, no event to resist. Instead, there was anticipation without endpoint. Waiting became a permanent condition. Some women attempted to navigate this environment by becoming indispensable. They learned languages. They mastered customs. They anticipated needs before they were voiced. This was not empowerment. It was adaptation under constraint. Being useful delayed removal. It did not prevent it. Others withdrew inward. Emotional distance became a defense. When the future cannot be influenced, detachment feels like control. Historical records cannot measure this internal shift, but its effects echo through the silence left behind.
The Mongol administration valued efficiency above all else. Households were expected to function smoothly. Disruption, even accidental, drew attention.
Attention invited scrutiny. Scrutiny rarely benefited those with the least power, and so compliance was not demanded loudly, it was assumed. This is why the most severe consequences rarely appear in chronicles. They did not need to. The system produced results without documentation. When someone vanished, the machinery adjusted and continued. No explanation was required because explanation itself was unnecessary. What history records are outcomes. What it omits are processes. In the rare cases where individual women appear by name, it is usually because their lives intersected with high politics.
A marriage that secured loyalty, a presence that symbolized conquest. Even then, their inner lives remained inaccessible. Their thoughts were not preserved. Their fears were not transcribed. Their silence was interpreted as compliance. This misinterpretation has persisted for centuries. Modern readers sometimes ask why there are so few accounts of resistance. The answer lies not in character, but in context. Resistance requires options. It requires allies. It requires a belief that refusal will change something. Under Mongol rule, refusal often only narrowed the range of possible outcomes.
Choosing survival was not submission. It was calculation. As time passed, the system normalized itself further. Children were born into households shaped by conquest, but structured as routine. For them, the absence of choice did not feel like loss, it felt like the world. This generational transition completed the work of erasure. What began as policy became background. This is where memory becomes dangerous. To remember how these systems were built is to recognize that stability was not neutral, it was engineered. And its cost was paid privately, in spaces history chose not to illuminate.
Midway through this account, it is worth asking why these stories still matter. Not as moral lessons imposed on the past, but as warnings about the nature of power itself. Dark Inquest history continues this examination because forgetting does not make systems disappear. It allows them to repeat, disguised as tradition. The Mongol Empire's treatment of captured women was not an aberration. It was an expression of a broader truth, that large systems often rely on quiet harm rather than visible cruelty, that efficiency can coexist with suffering, that order can be maintained without justice.
The psychological impact of this environment cannot be overstated, even if it cannot be fully documented. Living under constant evaluation reshapes perception. Time becomes fragmented. The future shrinks. Identity dissolves into function. Over years, this internal erosion leaves little that can be recognized as freedom. Some women outlived the empire that absorbed them. When political structures weakened, their circumstances did not automatically improve. New authorities inherited old practices. Continuity persisted. Liberation was not guaranteed by collapse.
This is the hidden durability of such systems. The darkest moments were not always dramatic. Often, they were administrative. A decision made elsewhere. A transfer ordered without explanation. A door closed because a document had changed hands. These moments rarely involved confrontation. They involved finality. One such turning point appears again and again in fragmented accounts. The realization that return was impossible. Not delayed, not denied temporarily. Impossible. When that understanding settled in, Resistance lost its meaning. What remained was endurance.
This is the climax history rarely acknowledges. Not an act, but an awareness. The moment when hope narrows into routine, when the mind adapts to permanence, when silence stops feeling temporary. After that point, the system no longer needed to assert itself. It had been internalized. In the aftermath of Mongol rule, successor states inherited both territory and practices. Trade routes reopened, cities rebuilt, laws evolved. But the individuals whose lives had been reshaped did not reappear in records as survivors. They appeared, if at all, as wives, mothers, servants, roles stripped of context.
Their original identities were gone. What survived were patterns of redistribution, of enforced dependency, of silence mistaken for consent. These patterns did not end with the Mongols. They were studied, adapted, and reused by later empires that admired Mongol efficiency while overlooking its human cost. This is how history repeats without repetition. The women captured during Mongol expansion were not remembered as victims, because victimhood was not useful to empire. They were remembered, when remembered at all, as components of success. Their suffering was not denied.
It was irrelevant. And irrelevance, when imposed, is a form of control. As the centuries passed, the Mongol Empire became legend. Its speed, its discipline, its reach. The quieter stories were left behind, buried in archives, hinted at through absence rather than testimony. To recover them now requires reading what is missing as carefully as what remains. Not erased by time, but by design. The story does not end with the fall of an empire. It ends with the normalization of what should never have been normal, with silence accepted as closure, with endurance mistaken for agreement.
And that is why this history unsettles, not because it is uniquely cruel, but because it is disturbingly familiar. What followed the Mongol Empire's fragmentation was not recovery for those it had absorbed. Empires dissolve on maps, systems linger in people. The women who had been redistributed, reassigned, and silenced did not return to a former life when borders shifted. There was nothing to return to. Their original worlds had been dismantled, their identities overwritten by years of enforced adaptation. History records succession, not repair. In later chronicles, the Mongol period is often treated as a phase, violent, transformative, and then concluded.
But for those who lived inside its private structures, there was no clear endpoint. New authorities inherited established households. Old expectations persisted under new names. Stability resumed without reckoning. This is how harm outlives power. Cultural memory adjusted accordingly. Songs celebrated conquest. Records praised efficiency. Legal traditions borrowed selectively from Mongol precedent. The lives quietly consumed by these systems were not framed as losses. They were framed as inevitabilities. The absence of protest was taken as evidence of order.
But silence is not evidence of peace. The women at the center of this history were not forgotten because time erased them. They were forgotten because remembering them complicated a narrative that valued continuity over accountability. To acknowledge their experiences would have required admitting that expansion depended not only on strategy and discipline, but on lives constrained until choice itself dissolved. What history records is outcome. What it omits is cost. Their stories survive indirectly, in genealogies that shift without explanation, in cultural practices that appear without origin, in the quiet persistence of rules designed to manage uncertainty through control.
These traces do not speak loudly. They do not accuse. They simply remain. And remaining is enough. The final consequence of the system was not suffering alone. It was normalization. When endurance is demanded long enough, it begins to look like consent. When silence is enforced consistently, it begins to feel natural. That is the most enduring legacy of organized power. This wasn't chaos. This wasn't excess. This wasn't accidental. It was a structure that functioned precisely because it did not need to announce itself. What they don't teach is how easily order can be built on quiet harm.
What wasn't written down is how many lives were shaped by decisions made elsewhere without appeal or witness. Buried in the archives are not screams, but absences, and absences tell their own story. Not erased by time, but by design. The Mongol Empire is remembered for how fast it moved, how far it reached, how effectively it ruled. It should also be remembered for what it required to maintain that reach, for the people whose futures were narrowed until survival meant disappearance, for the women whose endurance was mistaken for acceptance, because recording anything else would have disrupted the myth of stability.
The story ends not with liberation, but with continuity, with systems passing quietly into tradition, with silence treated as closure. And that is the final injustice. If keeping the memory of those whose lives were absorbed rather than recorded matters, then subscribing to dark inquest history is not a gesture of support. It is an act of refusal. A refusal to let silence stand in for truth. A refusal to allow order to erase the cost that sustained it. Because the last thing taken from these women was not their freedom. It was their place in history